Welcome to Leaders' Questions, where Ireland's leaders face the heat, the pressure, and the toughest questions of the day.
Today, at last, and after an unnecessarily long break, we have arrived at the first Leaders' Questions session of this new government term, and I want to raise with you the emergency situation affecting communities all across this island, and that is, of course, the ongoing fallout from Storm Éowyn. At the outset, my thoughts and those of my Labour colleagues are with all those families and households who've been so severely impacted by the storm. Many households still continuing to suffer the consequences, both of the storm itself and of the weakened infrastructure and the insurance and cost implications that they are now facing into the future. All our thanks go, and I'm sure all of us agree on this, to the frontline workers who've been working tirelessly over the past weeks to restore power and water supplies to communities, often in dangerous conditions. Taoiseach, people from affected communities have a multitude of justified concerns about the government's response to the crisis, and they speak with one voice when they say they need help. But they have been really severely impacted. I've heard from families who were tragically forced to wake their dead relatives by candlelight, from parents unable to cook a hot meal for their bored and cold young children, from older people left terrified and isolated by power outages and fallen trees, from people with chronic health conditions whose appointments were cancelled or to which they couldn't access them. I heard just today from one family in Roscommon who are still without power and will remain so likely until this coming weekend. They say they've had no electricity, no heat, no water since 24th January. And this has been the case 4 times now in the last 10 weeks. And they ask, what is the government going to do about this? They need, as do all those affected, greater supports. And they cannot afford the financial cost that the ESB is now saying that it may pass on to all consumers to cover the cost of repairs. Especially wrong at a time when the ESB is reaping operating profits of nearly €500 million. Taoiseach, it's projected that Ireland will face more frequent weather disasters as global temperatures rise, and we're already witnessing more regular awful weather events. Hurricane Ophelia, storms Babette, Dara and Eunice in recent times, and more storms, freezes and floods likely due to climate change, which will bring more disruption and more damage. There's a careful balancing act, Taoiseach. We must take decisive climate action to play our part in mitigating climate chaos, but we must also build real resilience against inevitable weather disasters, building up security in our energy sector, our water systems, our broadband and transport networks. And we must ensure that the necessary transition to cleaner energy will not leave communities behind. The first National Climate Change Risk Assessment will be published soon by the EPA and will help us better to understand how to adapt our infrastructure. But Taoiseach, I'm asking you now, on behalf of the families, the households that we've all heard from, what will your government do to protect our infrastructure, and what will you do to support struggling households trying to cope now with the aftermath of the storm, struggling to meet bills? What urgent supports will you supply to communities to restore infrastructure?
Storm Ufása be own, an ceannas messa stocha bhí riamh, ní léon áras ar sin, agus caithimid bheith anna bhuíoch de gachéine a thú cór agus tachaíocht do dhaoine ar fud na tíre. Just want to say that this was a severe, unprecedented storm, the likes of which we have not witnessed in living memory. And it caused widespread devastation across the country, particularly the western seaboard and the northwest of our country. And many, many people have suffered a lot during this period because of power outage, because of water, lack of water, and also, very worryingly for many people, the collapse of the communications network as a result of the ferocity of the wind and the storm itself. It's the worst, I would say, in a century. And the first priority of all involved in planning in the National Coordinating Group was to protect lives. And unfortunately, we had one fatality in Casper Dudek. There could have been many, many more. The red alert warning was effective and impactful, and we should never lose sight of that. And there are issues that we have to reevaluate in respect of how we do the red, orange, or yellow system. And that's underway. In terms of the grid, I've already taken action. I would have met with the Minister and the Department of Climate to Taoiseach. I've asked, and it's happening, that we would accelerate the grid infrastructure capital plan and to bring elements forward, and we want that within the next month, in order that we move very fast to make the grid more resilient. I agree the severity of storms and the frequency of such severe storms is only going to increase. In fact, if you look at the figures over the last 20 years, there's a dramatic increase in both volume and severity of storms. So we do have to make our country more resilient. That will mean substantial funding in the updated National Development Plan for adaptation, which we do need to do far more on across the board. But in respect of the grid, there are some practical things we can do very, very quickly. And we have to cut through a lot of regulatory frameworks to enable us to do that, in terms of proper corridors for the grid, where we don't have trees and forests impacting on the grid as they did in this particular one. And human safety and health and safety have to be the priority. And that's going to happen in respect of the grid. In respect of water, and I will be meeting with the utilities in this respect, I don't think it was good enough that we didn't have, or that Irish Water didn't have generators in place at all locations.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
That's now happening, and that will not happen again.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
If I get a chance at the next. Sorry,
Well, Taoiseach, I think we all appreciate just how ferocious this storm was, and I do want to join with you in expressing sympathy to the family of the young man so tragically killed, Kasper Dudek. But it is simply unacceptable that we still see 18,000 homes, farms and businesses without power, so many days on from the outbreak of the storm. And it's clear that much more urgent action is necessary from government to invest the money that we in Labour had called for investing in the grid. We had called for investment of some of the Apple monies in building up the grid so that we would build in that resilience. And there's also the issue, Taoiseach, of the lack of supports for households. One constituent tells me she recalls during COVID how swiftly funding was put in place for hospitality to be able to serve outside, just for example. Why do we not see funding available from government to provide those in the most affected areas with support to put in place measures to mitigate against inevitable future power outages? The generator supplies that you mentioned, the sort of emergency backup facilities that were so sadly lacking in so many of the most affected areas. What we want to hear from you today, Taoiseach, is a clear outline of substantive measures that can be put in place now to support families.
Please.
3,000 ESB networks crew members with crews from the UK, France, Finland, Germany, Austria, Norway and the Netherlands. I want to thank all of those 3,000 people involving all of those crews. I mean, we can say do it. They're working day and night since the storm began. There is no additional capacity other than what's there in that 3,000 crew members. And I think we have to pay a very strong, sincere tribute to the crews of the ESB networks and all those crews who came from overseas to help us in what has been the worst storm in living memory. Now, the last framework for the ESB networks, the cost of the capital investment from, I think, 20 to 25 was about 5 billion. The estimate is we have to go to 13 billion in the next 5 years. That is the level of change and investment that will be required to make our grid resilient. But I'm determined to do that.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And this government is determined to do that, and will work with you if you have any other additional ideas.
And we now move to
Like, share, and subscribe to stay informed and help drive positive change.